Well, my lay definition is coercive control is behavior that is designed to take away your civil rights. It's power and control over you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Shafer, your host of Talks with Dr. Shafer. I'm a physician, mom, life coach, musician, author, and I am passionate about using storytelling as a tool to help you reclaim and reframe your story so that you can build your most beautiful future. And today I am so grateful and honored to be joined by a special guest, Jennifer C. Parker. She's a licensed therapist. She created a wonderful group called the Women's Voices Group, and she is the author of the wonderful, informative, supportive book, Coercive Relationships. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really excited, and I love the fact that you like to focus on story because that's so important for healing. So
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I have found on my journey, I think we spend a lot of time in our lives making our story about other people. And a big part of healing is just pulling it back and really reclaiming that story and reframing it, taking out all the extraneous things and really focusing on what our story is so that we can move forward and write the next chapter.
Absolutely. Yeah. It can really clarify things when you kind of look at what is my story, not what people want my story to be or what people have told me my story is. So
Yes. And you discussed that at the beginning of your book. You mentioned things like shoulds, the things that people tell us we should think or be. So let's start with giving our audience, in case they haven't heard this term before, a definition of what is coercive control.
well, my lay definition is coercive control is behavior that is designed to take away your civil rights. It's power and control over you. It's all kinds of behaviors. And in my book, I have a checklist of 12 of them. And 10 of them are emotional, psychological kinds of abuse, not the physical. 2 of them are physical. But all of them are designed over time to take away control over your life through fear, domination, intimidation, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I went through those, and I do want to, during our discussion today, mention them one by one. I have them written down, or if you want to go through them, I think it's really impactful to actually hear them
Oh,
so that listeners can maybe take some time to reflect on whether or not someone they know, or maybe even they themselves, are maybe experiencing something that they haven't been aware of in the past.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I wrote down your 12 bricks. And by the way, I love that you use this term. I made a podcast about the sensation of being encased and entombed in these bricks of the
Okay.
shoulds of
Uh-huh.
your life. And so that just so resonated with me.
Okay.
But you started with number 1, seduction.
Yes, seduction. So sometimes things that don't seem at first to be controlling, coercively controlling, become that way. Like, for instance, if someone is like, oh, let me do this for you. Let me go out and do different people experience different kinds, but let me go out and I'll pick out your clothes for you, or I'll buy all of our groceries, or I'll take you here or there. And it may seem as if it's benign and loving and caring, but when it becomes you have no choice, when it becomes later on, so those kinds of things can we can miss. And so it's important sometimes to see some of those things as, well, let me learn a little bit more about this person. What is that about?
Mm-hmm.
you know if you're early in a relationship, I call them yellow flags rather than red flags. It's like, oh, okay, they want to spend all their time with me. Well, that's kind of normal for a new relationship, a new love. You might want to spend a lot of time with them too, but maybe find out a little bit more, like, is it okay for you to spend time with other people, or does it become somehow, oh, poor me, or you must not care about me as much, or then
Yeah.
it's important to kind of examine that a little bit. So yes,
Mm-hmm.
there's
Test the
seductive
waters.
sorts of things. Things
Mm-hmm.
that, and particularly, let's say not everybody has low self-esteem, but if you come from a background where you have low self-esteem, where maybe your family treated you in such a way that occurred, then it might feel really good to you at first to get all kinds of attention and so forth until the coercion really starts to come out, until you can't be yourself, until you can't have your own opinions and so forth. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And there are so many issues with that initial infatuation stage. If you move too quickly within a relationship
Mm,
and you're in that stage where you're seeing these yellow flags, but you want more than anything for them to be
yes.
good
Yeah.
and not red flags. So you're making excuses, or you're saying, well, they really love me and they're the first person who loves me this way. How could I walk away from someone like that? How will I ever find someone like that again?
Right, right. That can be the seductive part of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that really can hook you. And as you've discussed before, after you're hooked and after you've established a relationship, if you haven't been, kind of critical in a good way off the top of forming a relationship,
Mhm.
once you're invested in one another, it can be really difficult to disentangle from someone.
Right, exactly. You're emotionally invested, particularly when a relationship becomes sexual. For many people, that's an additional hook. And on top of it, it's really hard to believe that somebody that you've had wonderful, loving experiences with would hurt you, would not be interested in your best interest. It's something, it's a disconnect for us. It's like we can't believe that, and that's understandable. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's part of why I want to reach out and let people know what's the difference between healthy relationship boundaries and unhealthy. And it's about being able to set boundaries. Is it okay for you to set boundaries and set limits?
Yes, boundaries are so incredibly important. And I really think that with boundaries becoming such a more common word in our lexicon now compared to in years prior, I really hope that people are learning how to use them and understanding that they are a bridge. They are not a wall.
Right. Exactly.
They're the way that we connect in a healthy way. They're
Exactly.
not a disconnecting factor. The second brick in your 12 bricks of coercive control is isolation.
Very important one. And one of the first most important things for people when they're beginning to want to examine the relationship, wanting to heal, wanting to figure it out, is to not be isolated. So being isolation can come both from the partner not wanting you to have contact with others. So they might subtly and not so subtly put roadblocks to you being able to connect with family and friends and so forth. Or they may tell you, you really don't need to work. I earn enough money, you don't need to do that. So again, isolating you even from that work environment. But another way that people become isolated, and it's totally understandable, is initially you start to feel like I must be doing something wrong, or this is a reflection on me, how I'm being treated. So I don't want anybody to know. Therefore, they start to kind of pull back from having contacts with friends and family because they're afraid they're going to see something, or they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to confide in them. And so then that leads to an isolation that limits your feedback. It limits, whatever the other person might be saying about you or saying to you. It's harder to get other feedback about whether or not that's true. Um, so isolation is really crippling for people if they're experiencing coercive control. I mean, it's crippling for everybody because we're social animals. Now we each need, different amounts of social contact. Some of us are more introverts, some of us are more extroverts, and that's okay. But we do need social contact and social support. And no one can get it
Exactly.
from one person.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to say. We are so complex as human beings, and we would never expect that we could eat the same food every day and be
Mhm.
fine, or watch the same show or read the same book every single day and be fine. So if someone's telling you, no, really, I mean, I love you so much that I just need you all to myself and I don't want to share you with others,
Mhm.
that means they're not really wanting you to be a complete human. And
Mhm.
that's problematic.
That is
to,
problematic. And by the
yeah.
way, that can be a yellow flag also to pay attention to if someone you begin dating or seeing doesn't have many friends or gives them all up totally because they want to devote all their attention to you. That can be a concern because, as you said, all of us, no one person can meet everyone's needs. And if we expect that, that pretty quickly can become very dominating. So
Dominating and exhausting for the person that's
mhm.
been put in this position to be completely fulfilling for someone else, and
Right.
usually at the same time sacrifice their own needs and their own fulfillment.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. The third brick of coercive control that you mention in your book is devaluation.
Devaluation. Yes. So if someone is constantly, if you give your opinion or express a need or a want, if someone is constantly devaluing it, saying, what's wrong with you? You're crazy to say that or to want that, or, that's not important and that kind of thing, that doesn't feel good. That doesn't feel good. And when it's somebody you love, you're much more vulnerable than if it's your next door neighbor, right? Who's doing that, treating you in that way. And so over time, it really becomes corrosive to your self-esteem. It can. If you're not,
Mm-hmm.
again, if you're not seeing it right away and not catching on to what's going on and what the design is, which is if you don't feel real strong in yourself, if you don't feel good about yourself, then you're much less likely to push back. You're
Mm-hmm.
more likely to submit, right?
Yeah. And I think also there's an element in my mind of distraction. So if you're on the hamster wheel, you're not on a track, you're on the hamster wheel and you're just running, 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 running. Eventually I'm going to get there. I'm going to show them that I'm worthy. They're telling me all these ways I'm not meeting the metric. And instead of taking a step back and saying, hey, stepping off the wheel and saying, hey, that's not accurate. No, you just run, 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 still trying to convince them of your worth. That is so distracting and uses up all of your energy. You don't even have energy to think about whether it's right or wrong.
I'm glad you said that. Yes, definitely. It is very distracting that, and it's something that we can fall into because it's like, well, if you're buying into, well, this doesn't make any, why is he, I must be doing something wrong kind of thing, then you constantly trying to please. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a natural human response to protect what we believe in instead of break the mold and develop a new belief. And so you're protecting that relationship or what you believed about the relationship when it began, when it was in the seduction period before the isolation and the devaluation started.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The fourth brick of coercive control you mentioned in the book is negation. Can you talk about that?
That is really like denying what they have done. Like maybe they said or they did something that you're complaining about. And it's like, I didn't do that. So it's like denying your reality. And one time in one of my workshops, somebody said, you don't really include gaslighting in there. And I didn't name that gaslighting, but that's
Mm-hmm.
really all about gaslighting.
Yeah.
So it's really questioning your reality. Sometimes that morphs into, there's something wrong with you. You must be crazy or something because that didn't happen. So
Right.
over time, it's like, well, I think that's what you said, you start to question yourself, which is a normal, healthy thing. In healthy
Mm-hmm.
relationships, we should give the benefit of the doubt to our partners. Okay.
Yes.
But that gets taken advantage of in a coercively
Mm-hmm.
controlling relationship. And so
Mm-hmm.
making that switch of, no, this is not a situation where I should give the benefit of the doubt. This is not a situation where I should question myself. It's like, what's going on with this person that they do things and then they say they didn't?
Exactly. And I think if you take a step back, if you're in a place where you can take a step back and take stock of the situation and try to see if you have equity in the relationship and in the interactions, yes, it's such a beautiful thing to give someone the benefit of the doubt. But I think it's really important that that's a two-way street, that both of you are doing that.
Exactly. Two-way street with everything, mutual.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And so I think typically with negation, as you said, it's one way. It's no, you're wrong. Did you forget?
Yeah. Or I told you to do this and you,
Yeah. Did you forget you're wrong? It's always you.
there you go.
and, I shouldn't make light of it, but that's the thing about self-awareness. When you get to the point and you take that step back, you step off the hamster wheel and you look at all of these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes you go through the first part of it, which I want to get to too. You had such beautiful subject lines and chapter titles in the book that take you through that process of, at first, this is just an aching. When you're going through these bricks and you see yourself in them, it is just an aching.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then now that you've seen it, it's an elephant in the room, as you mention in the book. And then you have to start making your own decisions about what to do with the elephant in the room.
True.
And pace yourself in that process, because it took a while to get here and it's going to take a while to get where you want to go.
That's right. And not judge yourself for how long it takes, because it is a process. And it's a process of grief, by the way.
Yeah.
When you love a person and yet you're not okay with how you're being treated, you don't just fall out of love with somebody overnight. And so there's grieving about the losses that are involved, the loss of what you thought you had or what you were going to have, and so forth.
Yeah. And I wonder if in part also there's a grieving of the loss of the person that you were and became, that you can no longer be to move forward.
Right, right. I was just talking to someone the other day who's working with me, not a client in the past or present, but she is the survivor of an abusive relationship. And she said, and this happens with many people, not everybody, overnight, when they married, she was now property.
Mm-hmm.
So things might even look really, she said, maybe, now with her educated mind, she can kind of see there were some flags, but it wasn't anything big deal until the night of their wedding. It totally changed.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
not to have shame about that, not to blame oneself. It's like it takes time to really recognize that when you're in a love relationship, oftentimes. And then it takes time to grieve and to figure out what you want to do.
Yes. And I think, we do live in a culture where shame and expectation is a big part of parenting techniques often, and educational choices, and how we discipline even in school, and how we interact with our peers at times. There's just this fear shame dynamic and how we are approaching life often. So let's say you became engaged to someone and everything seemed wonderful, and even before the wedding you're starting to see that it's a yellow flag, and then whoop, red flag comes up. You've already paid your deposits and you've sent out the invitations, and you tell your friends, and they may say, oh, you may have jitters, or they may say, well, you can always get divorced. The things,
Yeah.
quite truly, the messages that people receive when they are trying to share, my gut's telling me something, my nervous system is telling me something's not right. The feedback they get is often corrective feedback instead of connecting.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And devaluing in its own way. Not that they necessarily intend that, but their own
Right.
fear or their own judgment about things comes up.
Right. And the way that they were responded to when they would raise something like that in their family system or in their social circles. And I think that just cycles back to the importance of developing your sense of self so that you are resilient to these influences and these statements, because they don't belong to you. They belong to other people.
Yes.
So getting back to the 12 bricks of coercive control, after negation comes neglect. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Can you imagine maybe losing a parent and having your partner not be at all empathetic or just expecting you to go on as life as normal, and maybe even putting down your sadness and so forth. That's a type of neglect. That's a neglect of your emotional needs. It's also a neglect of your emotional needs if you're not allowed to do anything on your own, or purchase things that you need. For some coercive controllers, they're very financially controlling, and so it's like you don't get to, like I'd like to have a new dress. No, that's not okay, even though they might go out and spend all kinds of money on things they don't ask permission about, but somehow you have to
Yeah.
ask permission. Well, that's a type of neglect too. It's a neglect of your civil liberties. You're an adult. You're not a child who needs to be governed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it cycles back to that devaluation of also, okay, well, but no, I'm just helping you. You're bad with money. Remember? You're bad with money, even if that's not actually factual.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So the sixth point you make in your 12 bricks of coercive control is alienation from children. Can you talk about that
Oh
process?
man, for those people for whom it happens, I think they say that is the most painful, the most long lasting painful thing. Because um, if they're totally alienated from their children because of what has been said by the other partner about them, this, of course, is, well, it can begin when you're still with the person, but it most especially happens after a divorce or separation. And if this happens, losing your children, you can just imagine. It's bad enough to lose a partner. Um, and there are lesser amounts of that happen in terms of children coming and well, Daddy said, you're just you're taking all the money, and they don't have enough to live on themselves, when you know that that's not the case. Well, first of all, they're using the children. They're putting the children in the middle. They're treating them as if they're
Mm,
another adult, for instance, and confiding in them. And that's not okay. That's
yeah.
really a part of child abuse, I believe. But anytime that you're putting down another parent, that's hurting a child. That's not okay. That's
Yeah.
different from just treating things factually, like, if mom or dad has an alcohol problem, well, that's a fact, but you don't have to put the person down about it.
Mm-hmm.
How you
Yeah.
talk about it is very different. So,
Yes.
but alienation from children is extremely difficult, or just dealing with how, the things that are being told to the children, and learning how to talk to the children about that in a way that doesn't participate in putting them in the middle. It's
Yeah.
tricky. And that, it's really helpful to have some support with that.
Yeah, because it's really challenging too when you are, you have a child coming to you and they're saying, well, daddy says this about you, and you don't want to further that cycle, right? You want to try to stop the cycle.
Right.
And that can be really challenging, especially if you haven't done the necessary healing from the abuse that you experienced.
Right.
And now you're being triggered by seeing your children being abused,
Mm-hmm.
trying to get to the point where you accept the level of control you have in that situation and exert that in a judicious way by being the person your children need you to be in that moment.
Yes. And it can also be challenging if your children are mimicking the other person and treating you
Mm.
verbally. Mostly it's
Mhm.
verbally, it could be physically, like the other person.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's challenging because it can begin to feel like I'm being abused all over again.
Mhm.
And when I was working with people, I would encourage them in terms of seeing that as that's an injury to the children, that they're being
Yeah.
taught that. And that, it's natural for children to mimic, and particularly they tend to mimic the person who seems more powerful. And a lot of that
Mhm.
behavior also comes from, if they don't do it, the attention might be focused on them, the control on them. And so they want to
Mhm.
avoid that.
Yeah.
But so it's really important for the person, the victim, the one who's been victimized, to learn to be assertive with her children in terms of parenting, but in a way that isn't putting down the other person. It's like, we don't talk that way in this family.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're a family.
Yeah.
We don't talk
Yeah.
that way. This is how I'd like for you to express that, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, you know, and then anytime they bring up, well, daddy says this or mommy says that, depending on who's the abusive person, you know, it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
this is how we behave in this family, and this is what I think.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting because I think you could look at that experience for the child from many angles, good or bad. I think as someone who grew up in with a blended family and multiple homes as a young child, I experienced that. I think one of the gifts from that experience, having one home that was maybe more supportive and a healthier environment than the other, was that I got to see something else.
Mm-hmm.
One side couldn't dictate what the other side did, nor should they.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, there are some circumstances, you would love to be able to just negate that altogether, but unfortunately, it's not something we can always do. But the other household could provide structure, stability, regulation. And so that way you at least learn those tools. Maybe you don't see it all the time, but you get to see a broader version of the world that, not every family is the same. And that's a strength to move forward into life with.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a very good point. And that's something that I try to have worked with people on in the past. Sometimes people will begin to think, well, maybe I shouldn't have left because look at what I'm having to deal with now. And to give themselves credit for what they're offering their children that they wouldn't be able to if they had stayed. You
Right.
know, a
Yeah.
healthier approach to, you know, as hard as it can be, but a healthier approach to parenting, to, you know, what it's like to be in a relationship, those kinds of things. So,
Yeah, it's so painful, but if even half of the time, 50, often it's 50% of the time, just the way that things are right now and, family law and how custody is approached. Maybe you only have your kids half of the time, but half of the time they get to see the environment that you choose to construct for them, which, you hope is that you learn from your experiences and you choose to make an environment that is loving and supportive and is really focused on growth and not
yeah,
on control.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The next brick of course control that you mentioned is betrayal. Can you talk about that?
Well, oftentimes people think of betrayal in terms of uh, affairs, those kinds of things. And so that's certainly one piece of it. It's also, and these kind of all work together and relate to one another. So there's also just the emotional betrayal of not being the healthy partner that you thought you had, of not having your interests, not being concerned about what your interests are, what your needs are. That's a betrayal as well. So
Mm-hmm.
whatever the betrayal is, I know someone who talks about dealing with betrayal trauma. You know, it can be a trauma over time. It's like, wow. And I have known people who came out of it who didn't trust themselves. It's like, well, I was betrayed big time. My judgment, they labeled their judgment wasn't good, so I'm not going to trust myself to get into another relationship, which is
Mm-hmm.
sad, you know, because it's really, um, because it's possible to learn, okay, what do you look for? You know, it's important to regain that trust in yourself. And that's part of the importance of really working on recovery and healing so that you can create that life you want and not hold yourself back from experiences that you want to have, but also be
Mm-hmm.
able to um, tell when there might be somebody who's not so healthy in your life. So,
I love that approach on focus on your personal self and growing your understanding of how you are interpersonally relating with others so
right.
that you can really heed your own cues about how you feel around people
Yes.
instead of just continuing on in this cycle, which is so common. That's the fear, right? That you're going to go from one
Mm-hmm.
course controlling relationship to another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's also a myth. So yes, it does
Mm.
happen, but there are many people who don't.
Yeah.
that
No, I,
that
yeah.
they're able to see it and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah,
No.
I completely agree that there is, and I really, that's a part of why I'm such a proponent of doing that self-work and growing as a person and just really coming home to yourself. So then when you invite people to your table, you're inviting them to sit with you, not to lord over you at the table, because the table's totally different once you do that. So I
Mhm.
hope that people aren't afraid to invite someone to their table. They just have to be careful who they invite.
Right, right. Yeah. And later on in my book, when I get to the sections where what do you want to change? That's not exactly the title, but what can I change, and then how do I move
Mm-hmm.
forward? It's like really focusing on where are those things that make me more vulnerable that will help me to make different
Mm-hmm.
choices in the future. But I don't want that to be understood that somehow you should have known ahead of time. It's like life is a process, and we don't get a lot of education about coercive control or abuse, the signs of abuse in our lives, particularly at the age at which we typically are, looking for intimate relationships when we're younger. And I hope that's changing to some extent. It would be good to have more education for that in high schools and so forth, even middle school. Um, but typically it hasn't happened. And
Yeah.
as a professor said to me in graduate school, we can't know what we don't know, which sounds so simple, but we can't know what we don't know. And so
Yeah.
stop blaming yourself for it. It's like, okay, life brings us opportunities for learning. We can look at it in that way, and some of them can be quite painful. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And be careful where you look to for advice and support, because if you're looking to someone who doesn't know what they don't know,
yeah,
all they've ever known is control in their life, and that's how
that's
they were parented, maybe how they parented. If you turn to them for support, you may just end up feeling devalued all over again.
true. You
Yeah.
want to look to people who are able to encourage and support you, not tell you what to do, maybe not just give advice that you're not asking for. They may give suggestions, but in a non-controlling, non-judgmental sort of way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And can just, really encourage you to trust yourself.
It makes me think of the counter control that I think often when you have been long term around coercive control, it can be not an unusual thing to fall back into this counter control, trying to control the other person because that's all you've seen them do. And you're just kind of tit for tat, trying to grasp for
Mhm.
straws, trying to get some ground underneath you. And I think it's an important part of healing to help someone recognize where there's some counter control going on and help them release that. And again, just focus on the self.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, that's a good point, and I wonder, it seems kind of similar to what I talk about in terms of instilled beliefs. So if you start
Mm,
to believe one of the things that kind of a primary assumption in coercive control is that somebody has to be in control. There isn't power with mutual power, it has to be power over. If somebody has to be in control, if you start to get into that, and you're right, it's like you can begin to assume that when you've lived with it for so long. But then that's something
hmm
to take a look at, because yes, that's not going to take people where they want to go in terms of a mutual relationship.
exactly. And it's a part of the growth and the healing from that environment. And you need to, as you said, surround yourself with supportive people who can give you feedback and can provide different examples of what a relationship looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Feedback that's non-judgmental and objective, and yeah.
Exactly. No shame. No shame. Shame.
No
I
room for
really
that
think,
in my world.
I'm sorry. Yeah, no room for shame. Exactly. I could not agree more. I just think shame is so incredibly useless. I can't come up with a situation or circumstance where shame is a useful tool.
It's important to, we all need to take responsibility for whatever our issues are. We all have them, okay? We all make
Mhm.
mistakes sometimes, be accountable. But shame
Mhm.
is about feeling somehow you're not a worthy person. And that doesn't help anybody. Guilt,
Exactly.
okay, I can accept guilt when it's appropriate. When it's
Exactly.
appropriate.
Exactly. Exactly. Guilt, growth, accountability. Absolutely. Um, And then, so we've talked about the self-doubt as well that comes from this experience.
Mm-hmm.
Humiliation. Can you talk about that? Because I think that is so important to understand that as you go through this coercive control relationship, and I think the humiliation often starts to occur around the time where maybe the victim is starting to show a little bit of resistance, and it's a control mechanism to say, no, no, remember
Mm-hmm.
who's
I
in
know
control
about this
here.
about you, and I will tell everybody. I'll tell your friends what you said at some point, that was entirely in private, that you didn't mean for that to be shared. Or it also can have to do with forcing you to do things that are against your values or against your will. And that could be from a crime, but most usually it has to do with, other things. Maybe it's sexual behavior, maybe it's how you're dressing, maybe it's sexual acts that you feel ashamed about that can be humiliating, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
that it's used as a punishment, like if you haven't done what they wanted you to do, or you're somehow haven't conformed to what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So that humiliation, again, that really works on your self-esteem. It causes you to doubt yourself, especially if you're taking responsibility for um, doing it. And oftentimes people have said to me, they blame themselves hugely. They feel so guilty for not stopping it, not doing something without stopping and looking at, well, what were the reasons why you didn't? Because it felt like you had to pay such a high price, because maybe you weren't in a position to just leave suddenly, for all kinds of reasons. Maybe it's children, maybe it's you're not earning money, right? Whatever it is. Um, for people who might be immigrants, there's that sometimes gets used against them. So I got to off
Yeah.
of your topic a little bit, but
No, no, absolutely. And I mean, these are all things that if you're in an intimate relationship with someone, you would expect, whether things are going well or going badly, that those things be respected. And just as a part of your, again, human rights, a part of you being a human being, that, you won't mention the time that you were sexually assaulted as a child when things go wrong
right,
as a way to shame the person, or,
right,
you won't.
use it against them.
Exactly. You won't pigeonhole or basically kind of work, as you mentioned earlier. Oh, you don't need to work. I make enough money. And so then you get the person in the position where they're not working, maybe outside the home, or they're only working for their spouse,
Mm-hmm.
and they're completely dependent on their spouse, and they're homeschooling the children, and they're homeschooling the children, or they are, doing all of the cooking, doing all of the home chores. And at the end of the day, they're working more than they ever did before when they were working and earning money, but they don't have anything tangible to support themselves to show for it.
Mm-hmm.
So once things go awry, they don't have the financial means to hire a lawyer, for example, if this couple is married, or to get a place to live if they feel unsafe in the shared living space,
Mm-hmm.
and they feel really stuck.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah. It can feel to them like they're stuck, and they kind of
Mm-hmm.
going around in a circle in terms of feeling bad about themselves because of what I call coercive control injuries. They're typical, mental, emotional, behavioral, um, physical, of course, if there's physical abuse. Actually, there's physical injuries too because of the stress. Even if there's not been physical abuse, the stress of
Absolutely.
going through such a stressful relationship. So many people turn up with IBS and um, high blood pressure, things like that are physical injuries that really
Mm-hmm.
come from a lifetime of stress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even if you're just every day you are waiting for your spouse to come home and you and let's say your children as well, if you have children, you are anticipating needing to walk on eggshells to keep them satisfied and to
Hmm.
keep just to try to keep the environment the way that they want it to be. That's kind of maybe out of sync with what the environment would typically be, but you know they have certain rules and regulations for when they're home. When
Right.
you do that and your nervous system is just setting off all of the fear, fight, or flight neurochemicals in your body, and you're
Hmm.
doing that every single day. Or
Mm.
every time they text you and you know that you need to perform for them, or you're kind of anticipating, as you said before, that they're going to be devaluing you. They're going to be, informing you of something that you yet again did wrong.
Mhm.
All of that takes a toll on your nervous system and your body.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know how to talk about that very well. But yes, the neurological system, oh man, yes. The
Yeah.
hypervigilance that has to happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that, as you said about, and as you discuss in the book about pacing yourself, I think that CPTSD portion of it, that hypervigilance that you had when you are in a relationship that has coercive control, when it has, many of or all of these 12 bricks, when
mhm.
you're in that relationship and then it's over, it's not really over yet because it's left imprints on your body and
Yeah.
imprints on how your body responds to stimuli, even if you're no longer in physical
Mhm.
danger or in acute psychological danger.
Yes. I've known of people who were constantly surveying anytime they went out in public, were still looking at what looking for danger because, even though that person was long gone out of their life, didn't live anywhere near them, but it's still very hard to let go of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And, I did a episode about, if you are someone who has woken up someone standing over you repeatedly and they no longer live in the home,
Hmm.
but something happens and there's a creak, or maybe you close the door that night so you're so hyper vigilant, so the transference of some noise in the house is going to be different because it's hitting the door, and your nervous system is so cued to be so hyper aware of, is someone in the room, could
Hmm.
something happen, that long after they don't live there anymore, you can have disturbed sleep, your nervous system gets cued again with those neurochemical reactions, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, but you're not going back to sleep.
Sure.
You're worried about the bear that isn't in the room.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you also talk about the two physical items of the two physical
Mhm.
bricks and the course control, which would be physical injury and sexual injury.
Right. Yeah. And you can tick off all kinds of physical injury, whether it's slapping, pushing you up against the wall, shoving, hitting, punching, whatever those things are, using weapons or threatening to
Mm-hmm.
use weapons. Actually, that would
Mm-hmm.
be under intimidation too.
Mm-hmm.
And then sexual things, maybe forcing you to do sexual acts you don't want to, forcing you to have sex with other people, which also can happen. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Forcing, objectifying you, like constantly treating you as a sex object, like touching you in ways that just feel creeped out. It's not like it's a mutual attraction sort of thing, just constantly treating you that way. And and then of course rape, which many people are loath to call rape when it happens in an intimate abuse relationship. But if you don't give your consent, if you really don't want to have sex, and if you feel like you can't say that or you're going to get punched, that's rape.
Mm-hmm. Or you'll be locked out of the house, or you won't have, access to your finances or access to your children. I mean, there's so many ways
Mm-hmm.
to coercively control someone that don't involve physical. And I so appreciate that in your book and in the discussions you have with women and with survivors, that you don't minimize physical abuse, but you don't send the message to women that I think is often sent and survivors that, well, but did they hit you?
Yes. Oh, it was only emotional abuse. There's no only to it. You're probably aware of the research that shows that emotional abuse has just as much effect, psychological long-term effects, and physical long-term effects as physical abuse, unless it's life-threatening. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It really, there is that research that's out there. And when I used to do groups with people, I'd have them do an exercise where they put themselves on a continuum in the room of how afraid they were. And when asked, which one was worse for them, emotional abuse or physical, they all said it was the emotional abuse in terms of long-term effects, because that
Mm-hmm.
affects how you think about yourself, what you think is okay for you to do. I mean, long term, it can, if you're constantly told, oh, you don't know how to communicate, which happened with one person I remember in group, where every time she started to talk, she would apologize for how she was speaking because she knew she wasn't very good at it. Well, finally, one of the group members said, what are you talking about? You are so articulate and you say so many great things. I appreciate your feedback so much.
Mm.
Then she found out that her partner had always said, whenever she brought up a problem or a complaint or anything, oh, you don't, what are you talking about? You're crazy. You don't know how to talk, etc. And she believed it. So that's what I mean
Yeah.
by to instill belief. Over time, you come to think things about yourself that just really aren't true.
Yes, exactly. And you incorporate it into the fabric of your being. And so, again, to shed those beliefs, it almost feels like you have to shed yourself, but they never really belong to you to begin with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why it
Yeah.
takes some work, takes some time. Yeah.
Time and work for sure.
Yeah.
Now, to cycle back to what you said about group and how important it was for someone else to encourage, and I think also to share stories that resonate with someone who's been through something.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is hugely important because we can, as clinicians, sit here and talk about all of these terms and some, kind of examples of the definitions and things. But often, if you're not in a state of readiness to hear that message, it will still fly by you as if it doesn't belong to your story. That's not my story. That's this poor, woman or this poor man's story, but that's not my story.
Mm-hmm.
But when we can, as a third party, hear an actual story with people who resonate with us, or they're the same gender, or the same, they come from a similar upbringing, and we hear a song, or we read a book, or we see a compelling movie or short, and we see ourselves in this person, we see them go through the same experience, and all of a sudden, that aha moment where we say,
Mm-hmm.
that person's being abused, and that has happened to me.
Right.
And
Right.
just that momentary recognition of, oh my goodness, no, that's really not okay. It's not my fault. It's just not acceptable.
Right. Many times, what we say as therapists is certainly important, but it lands a whole nother way when somebody that you know has experienced it is also saying to you. And when you hear what the other person is saying, and you're able to say to that person, that's not okay. And you see that. And then it's like, oh, and you can begin to
Mm-hmm.
take that in a deeper way. Groups are
Yeah.
wonderful. They're so empowering. That's
That's
one of the
wonderful.
things
So,
I'm working on, getting my curriculum out there to people, because I want people to do more groups for survivors.
yeah.
Yeah.
How do you see that? So I'm from a relatively small city, right? And so I've thought about this in my area that I would love if there was a support group for women who are
Mhm.
dealing with, and men, of course, who are recovering from or really coming to the understanding that they're dealing with controlling people in their lives. How do we get groups like this available everywhere?
Well, usually domestic abuse agencies have support groups. So that's one thing. But the therapy groups, that's a whole nother thing. And it's a good question. I was pretty shocked when I retired from my therapy practice at the time. There was no other group like mine in Madison, which is not that small a place.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm really invested, and I want people to really have more of these kinds of groups, and what I found was effective. So, yeah.
That's wonderful.
Um, I think it takes somebody who's really interested in this issue
Mm-hmm.
and that
Mm-hmm.
is willing to develop the group. And yeah, and if you're a therapist and you're seeing clients who are intimate partner abuse survivors, well, then it's just naturally over time, not everybody is appropriate. Maybe they need some individual at first, or maybe, if they're dealing with social anxiety too, you have to you have to assess each person on an individual basis. But a lot of times it's like after a bit, they really benefit from being in group, and that they really can thrive more in that setting than an individual setting. So
Absolutely. And I think, when you don't have access to a group, maybe a tipping point again can be, hearing a song. And I love the movement. I don't know if you've noticed this in popular music now. I mean, there are certainly problems with popular music, don't get me wrong. But, as a musician, I grew up, gosh, date myself, but, 30 to 25 years ago, I was writing music for young women in the market. And it was all about, how you looked, how you behaved, getting attention. That is what you, as a songwriter, that's what they wanted you to provide for the market. And now the songs are just so incredibly inspirational and women focused.
I love how that's
And
shifting. Yes. Yes.
it's
It's a good point.
amazing. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this really informative conversation. I so appreciate you spreading this information for survivors and for people who maybe are really in that self-realization period of understanding the dynamics and the controlling people in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us where readers can access information about you and buy your book.
Well, in the show notes, I will supply my blog, my website with my blog if they want to sign up for my monthly blog and newsletter. I supply information that's really helpful for victims and survivors, as well as I've had many therapists say that they find it useful both as a resource for their clients, but that they learn things from it. And then my book you can find on Amazon if you prefer ebooks, but my publisher is offering a 20% off if you use the link with the code Black Rose Writing. So that will also be in the show notes, but you can get 20% off during the month of May. And then I have social media that I post on, just trying to keep and support survivors wherever they are. In terms of really knowing that there is hope and there's help out there.
That's so beautiful. And to just send that message, I call it the messy middle. It's okay if you're in the messy middle.
Yes.
It's okay. When we talk about these things and we're talking about them maybe from the other side,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it can feel maybe even a bit alienating, but we want to connect with people and say, no, whatever stage you're at, we're here. And there are people who are having similar experiences to you that you can encourage one another and support one another on your journey to coming back to yourself and reclaiming your life and your autonomy.
Yes. Yes. And that messy middle, I like to call it an incubation time, or I think there's
I love
another
that.
term too, but it's like sometimes people feel, oh, I feel so bad because of how long it took. Well, there's a grief process that you go through. It takes time. It's okay to be in the messy middle where you're not sure where you fall, what you want to do, because that's part of it. You're not.
Yeah.
It feels like you're not going anywhere, but you're contemplating.
Yeah, we can both guarantee you are going great places. Stick with it, believe in yourself, and the becoming will be happening. So just stick with yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, and thank you for
Oh,
having me.
thank you so much for being on the show. I am 100% certain that listeners have taken so much from this discussion. And I hope that if you are out there listening and you have concerns, you're a victim of domestic abuse or domestic violence, that you seek support. I am going to put a disclaimer on the episode with regards to domestic violence, and there will be notes after the show about how you can seek support. And please stay safe. And if you are having an emergency situation, call 911. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I appreciate your time. Please comment and share with us how this show impacted you, and let us know other topics you would like us to cover here at Talks with Dr. Shafer. Stay safe and take care.
Everybody's lonely, but you can hold on to me, and I will try to make it right. Everyone needs something. Let me be that one thing, and I will try to ease your mind. I can't bear another moment. I'm getting on the 'cause there's nothing